Good morning, everybody. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to Brussels and to see many old friends gathered here today in this wonderful venue to discuss the legal issues related to recent developments in the South China Sea. Marco Benatar and I have worked hard to provide you a program gathering prominent speakers and panel chairs knowledgeable in the field covered by this conference, namely fisheries, navigation, the regime of islands, and international dispute settlement. We are indeed very proud of the lineup of speakers and chairs who kindly accepted our invitation and that you find on the program today. Even though some of the people, after having accepted at an initial stage, had later, en cours de route, to decline the invitation to come to Brussels, either because of health or urgent professional reasons. Despite these setbacks, and there were a few, we truly are fortunate to have a number of excellent speakers with us today with in-depth knowledge of the matters to be treated. If for the panel chairs we looked in surrounding European countries, no such limit applied to the speakers, as you will notice from the program. This being said, up until yesterday, we had to face last-minute changes, and consequently, certain further announcements will have to be made by Marco Benatar before we get started. Personally, I would like to take this opportunity to address a question that I believe many of you may have been asking yourselves on the way to the Egmont Palace this morning. Why hold a conference on international law and the South China Sea in Brussels, a place so far away from the region, and organized by the Department of International and European Law of the Vrije Universiteit Brussel, a name we are not normally allowed to translate into English because of the possible confusion with our French sister university, the Universiteit de Brussel. Let me try to clarify this point, starting from the broader picture and ending up with the more concrete answers. Belgium was one of the pioneering countries in the effort to promote the peaceful settlement of international disputes at the end of the 19th century. It was, for instance, Gustave Rollin Jacquemin, who, together with a number of foreign colleagues, like colleagues from the Netherlands, Mr. Asser, or colleagues from the United States, David Dudley Field, who together had the idea of establishing what is today called the Institut de Droit International. This was done in Ghent in 1873. This was the first professional and international association of jurists devoted to the promotion of international law. Soon afterwards, the family Rollin also was instrumental in the establishment of the Association for the Reform and Codification of the Law of Nations, a name to be changed in 1895 to the International Law Association. No need to stress that these trailblazing organizations with roots in Belgium, of which the first one even received the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1904, are both still very thriving international organizations today. The Universiteit de Brussel also played a very important role in the movement to foster peaceful dispute settlement through international law. Reference can be made here, first of all, to Henri Lafontaine, professor of international law at that university until 1940, who in 1913 received yet another Nobel Prize for Peace for his unabated efforts in the peace movement and his quality of being a staunch defender of internationalism. It is, moreover, the son of the brother of Gustave Rollin Jacquemin, mentioned just a while ago, named Henri Rollin, who became the successor of Henri Lafontaine as professor of international law at the Universiteit de Brussel, where he taught until 1961 and continued to pursue the cause of world peace. Today, the Belgian Association of International Law still attributes the so-called Henri Rollin Prize for a doctoral thesis in the area of international law or international relations. If so far I have tried to indicate the good reasons why this conference should be held in Brussels by the, and I quote, Free University of Brussels, unquote, let me now turn to the explanation why the Department of International and European Law of the Vrije Universiteit Brussel is taking this particular initiative today. One of the 4 research clusters in the area of international law of this department is the law of the sea. At regular intervals, international conferences have been co-organized in this particular domain, mostly in tandem with our French sister university, the Université Libre de Bruxelles, the University of Ghent, and the Université Catholique de Louvain. It is, for instance, noteworthy that the first such major conference, organized in 1994, that means the year that the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea entered into force, was also held in this same Egmont Palace in Brussels and was entitled Belgium and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. In the year 2000, another major Law of the Sea conference was organized, entitled this time The Exclusive Economic Zone and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, 1982-2000. A first assessment of state practice. And at the very end of last year, in order to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the entry into force of the so-called Constitution for the Oceans, another major conference was convened together with the University of Ghent this time, entitled UNCLOS Rules the Waves. Regional themes have been addressed in the past by conferences organized by the department, but it must be admitted that they always related to European waters, such as the Baltic Sea or the North Sea. A conference focusing on the South China Sea, therefore, might still be considered somewhat out of step with our normal work in the department. Nevertheless, it should be remembered that our department finds its roots in 3 sub-centers, namely a center for the study of the law of United Nations and the specialized agencies, second, a general center on international law, and third, a center for the study of the East European socialist legal systems. This was at a time before the fall of the Berlin Wall, a time that I was still a very early stage researcher at this university. The first conference I was invited to participate in at that time, organized by the department at the occasion of the granting of the title of Doctor Honoris Causa to Professor Louis B. Sohn for his impressive contribution to the development of international law in general and the law of the sea in particular, was entitled, and I quote, The Compulsory Jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, a Turning Point, ? As member of the Center for the Study of East European Socialist Legal Systems, I decided to tackle the issue of what I optimistically called at that time the new attitude of the USSR. It was a story of hope, indicating how for the first time in its history, the Soviet Union had accepted a few, 6 to be precise, compromissory clauses in international agreements giving competence to the International Court of Justice for disputes arising with respect to the interpretation or application of the treaties involved. Much water has passed under the bridge since then, but today some of the optimism has waned, I must admit. A new tendency seems to be on the rise where major powers, having subscribed to a system of compulsory settlement of disputes, refuse afterwards to participate in proceedings initiated according to these previously agreed dispute settlement procedures. Having been personally involved in the Arctic Sunrise case between the Netherlands and Russia, it was indeed worrisome to see that no Russian counterpart showed up either before the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea during the phase of the provisional measures or before the Annex 7 Tribunal during the phase on the merits, more recently. And with this, I think the link to the South China Sea is easily made. Here as well, the People's Republic of China has so far refused to participate in similar Annex 7 Tribunal initiated by the Philippines. And even though no two cases are ever exactly the same in international law, enough similarities seem to be present to justify the interconnection for present purposes. Two arbitrations on the basis of Annex 7 of the 1982 Convention, for which the Permanent Court of Arbitration acts as registry, and in which one of the parties, between parentheses, a permanent member of the Security Council, refuses to participate despite having ratified the 1982 Convention. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, for all these reasons, we believe that a conference on the international legal issues affecting the South China Sea perfectly fits in this list of conferences that the Department of International and European Law has organized so far. But no matter how bright the ideas or how stimulating the expected exchanges may look from a scientific point of view, as long as one does not have the financial means to realize them, one is still stuck at square one. It is therefore reassuring that we have been able, all along the way, to rely on what I would call by now our in-house sponsor, Caspian Tradition, as you will see from the program, who deserves once again our most sincere thanks. Without our sponsor, we would simply not be here today. Having taken the opportunity to make the preliminary acknowledgement, let us now move to today's program. In order to do so, I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Marco Benatar, who will present us with a last update.
Thank you, Professor Franks. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, before I start with the announcements, I would just like to second the sentiment expressed by Professor Franks. I share it wholeheartedly. It is a real pleasure to be here today and to see you all present. Now on to the practical arrangements. So, as you could see from the conference brochure, there are 4 panels, and we envisage a time allotment as follows. Each panel has 2 speakers, and we would like to ask each speaker to speak for approximately 25 minutes. If they do so, this will allow us an additional 25 minutes to take questions from the audience. So each panel has a Q&A session, and we welcome you to ask or fire whatever questions you would like at our speakers. I'm sure they'll be happy to answer. For those of you not sitting around the table, there are 2 microphones which will be passed around if you have any questions. On this note, I would also ask you not to be shy. I can see that there are several places still available around the table, so if you want to be closer to the action, by all means, you can fill up these seats. There's no problem whatsoever. Right, so I wouldn't say, it would be a bit far to say that calamity has struck, but we have had a bit of bad luck this week because 2 of our speakers were not able to make it today. These are Mr. Blaise Quemlangan and Professor James Kraska. Unfortunately, Mr. Blaise Quemlangan was unable to attend on account of urgent professional reasons, and Professor James Kraska has fallen rather ill indeed and was unable to travel. But no worries, we have a cunning plan to solve this. It's actually not that cunning. For the first panel, we will proceed with our chair and speaker. We've kindly asked Professor McManus to speak a little bit longer, so we won't limit his time as we normally would. On that note, I'll be the time enforcer. And then, of course, there will be questions from the audience. As for the second panel, which Professor Kraska was going to attend, he kindly sent us a rather complete draft paper. So if you, with your indulgence, and if you put up with my boring reading voice, I will read from the paper, and this way you will also get his perspective. This on the understanding that these are not my words. I'm reading from a paper written by someone else. Right. Now that I've taken care of some practical arrangements, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who will be providing us with some opening remarks. And I would like to say a few things about Mr. Paul Rietjens. Since the 1st of May 2007, he is the Director General of Legal Affairs at the Belgian Federal Public Service of Foreign Affairs, and in that capacity, he is legal advisor of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Until that date, and since April 2001, he was legal counsel at the Permanent Representation of Belgium to the EU, where he dealt with international questions, and in that capacity was involved in the negotiation of a European constitutional treaty. Before his function at the Permanent Representation, Mr. Rietjens worked for more than 20 years at the Federal Public Service of Foreign Affairs, where he was assigned different responsibilities. Deputy Director General of Consular Affairs, Deputy Director General of Legal Affairs, Advisor, and later on Deputy Head at the Personal Office of the Minister, Deputy Advisor, and later on Advisor at the Directorate General for Political Affairs at the UN Desk and at the EU Desk. Currently, Mr. Rietjens is also chairing for 1 year now, in 2015, the Comité des Juristes of the Benelux. As well, for 2 years, this year and 2016, the Committee of Legal Advisors on Public International Law of the Council of Europe. And I'm happy to say that Mr. Rietjens is also alumnus of our university. He studied at the Vrije Universiteit Brussel, where he graduated with a Bachelor of Laws, a Special Licentiate in European Law, and a Special Licentiate in International Law. And so, without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Rietjens to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I also hope that it will be only my voice that will be boring. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor and a pleasure to host an international law conference on South China Sea in the premises of the Egmont Palace. This prestigious building was initially the home of the Earls of Egmont, who in the 16th century played a historical role in the birth of the Low Countries, today's Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. It was later inhabited by the Dukes of Arenberg, a German family with strong roots in Belgium. And the room we are sitting in is still called the Arenberg Room. The 18th century architecture of the building is their legacy. They were expropriated after the First World War, and the building was attributed to the official duties of the Belgian Minister of Foreign Affairs. Later on, the Egmont Palace was also the home to important negotiations regarding Belgium's institutional transformation. It is the place today where foreign dignitaries are being welcomed, and it's therefore the ideal venue to welcome you today as well. Today's conference will deal with a number of issues which over the years have been subject to customary international law, as codified in 1982 by the UN Convention of Montego Bay on the Law of the Seas, abbreviated as UNCLOS. UNCLOS is the official reference for the EU and therefore also for Belgium. UNCLOS provides an overarching framework for many aspects of ocean governance and has proved up to now an undeniable contribution to peace, security, and the rule of law. The different topics that will be addressed through this conference all fall under UNCLOS provisions, and it will be interesting to see how relevant they can be to the main topic of today. The South China Sea is not only of importance to the coastal states which surround it, but of course to the many countries which navigate through it. And we all know that world maritime traffic is still growing. As oceans all fall under the scope of UNCLOS, the challenges which may arise there are relevant to the whole of the oceans regimes. For lawyers and experts, such as those who are gathered here today, the South China Sea presents an interesting mix for debate. We are confronted with overlapping claims to sovereignty among coastal states. Different avenues can be explored, such as putting the case to arbitration. The negotiation of a code of conduct between ASEAN countries and China is another option which would certainly give comfort to the parties as to the use of peaceful means. Anyway, the final purpose is to find means for peaceful coexistence within the South China Sea by building confidence and trust, including through consultations and negotiations and in accordance with international law. In the meantime, the uncertainty about sovereignty may have implications on the subjects which will be examined here, such as fisheries, navigation, islands, and the international dispute settlement. The first item relates to fisheries. UNCLOS indirectly deals with this issue in its provisions on the exclusive economic zone. Articles 61 to 68 have provisions on marine species with regard to their conservation, their exploitation, fish stocks, migratory species and mammals, all situated within the exclusive economic zone. Article 73 deals with the enforcement of laws and regulations of coastal states in this regard. UNCLOS also deals with fisheries in the high seas under Articles 116 to 120, which regulates the right to fish, the duty of states with respect to the behavior of their nationals, and cooperation with other states regarding the conservation and management of living resources and marine mammals as well. An implementing agreement of UNCLOS has also been agreed in 1995 in relation to the conservation and management of straddling fish stocks and migratory fish stocks. It is in the interest of us all to promote the sound management of fishery resources against overexploitation and unsound catching methods. According to FAO data, worldwide fish catches in 2010 amount to $150 billion US. Marine wild fish is affected by declining quantities, growing prices, and growing total value. Not being a specialist, I look forward to the contribution of our learned guests with regard to fisheries in the South China Sea. In the EU, the issue of fisheries has been devolved to the European Commission, which represents the EU in international gatherings on this subject. The second item of today's conference deals with navigation. For centuries, navigation rights have also developed under customary international law. For both the EU and Belgium, safety and freedom of navigation are of paramount importance. UNCLOS has codified many of these rules under its provisions with regard to the right of innocent passage, under its Articles 17 to 32, which relate both to commercial ships and warships. UNCLOS also has specific provisions with regard to the use of straits for international navigation under its Articles 34 to 45. Preservation of freedom of navigation is the idea to be read behind many of the articles of the Convention. A large part of the world's trade is being channeled through the South China Sea and needs to be guaranteed against legal insecurity, which would affect all coastal countries and the world economy as well. Shipping volumes in the world have developed from 3 billion tons in 1985 to 9 billion tons in 2011, according to UNCTAD figures. And the South China Sea, the South China Sea area is in that regard one of the most heavily populated and traffic-intensive areas in the world, with 100,000 ships navigating each year in that area. The South China Sea is also home to many natural resources. The protection of the environment and sensitive ecosystems against coral reef erosion and the negative effects of heavy traffic are of paramount importance as well. Stability in this region is therefore of mutual interest and concern to all of us. UNCLOS provides us with the instruments to address these challenges, and I therefore hope that today's conference may contribute to that aim. The third item of today's conference relates to the regime of islands. Islands are being defined in Article 121 of UNCLOS as being, and I quote, naturally formed area of land surrounded by water, which is above water at high tide, end of quote. This article further states that, I quote, rocks which cannot sustain human habitation or economic life of their own shall have no exclusive economic zone or continental shelf, end of quote. I understand this is a very sensitive issue indeed, with regard to territorial claims made into the region. But UNCLOS offers us guidance on how international law is dealing with the matter. Only naturally formed areas of land come into consideration, and rocks which can sustain human habitation or economic life are being excluded from this definition with regard to the appropriation of an exclusive economic zone and continental shelf. For one to claim an exclusive economic zone or a continental shelf, a naturally formed area of land which is not limited to inhabitable rocks provides for a sound, legitimate basis. I also look forward to the views of our learned guests on this sensitive issue. Finally, the fourth item relates to international dispute settlement. The official EU position in this regard is to urge all parties concerned by incidents occurring in the South China Sea to seek peaceful and cooperative solutions in accordance with international law, in particular UNCLOS. The EU also calls on parties to such incidents to undertake de-escalating measures and refrain from any unilateral action which would be detrimental to peace and stability in the region. ASEM leaders confirmed this commitment at their summits in Vientiane in 2012 and Milan in 2014, and the G7 leaders expressed themselves in the same manner recently. UNCLOS provides for a great variety of instruments with regard to the settlement of disputes, starting with negotiations under Article 279 to 285, to continue with compulsory procedures involving a choice of international courts under Articles 286 to 296. It is my hope that today's conference will bring us new light into all avenues allowing for the peaceful settlement of disputes, which is in the genuine interest of all the stakeholders. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as a lawyer, I can confirm that today's conference is approaching the challenging issues involving the South China Sea from the right point of view, which is the legal one. UNCLOS indeed provides us with enough instruments to identify the genuine challenges facing the region and remedies to settle the differences in interests and claims. A rational identification of issues provides us quite logically with solutions in which the traditional power game finds a way out of confrontation. Whereas divergent views may be discussed and be interpreted through the light of the Convention, there is no sustainable outcome for violent action, which international law does not recognize. I wish you all a very fruitful exchange of ideas today. May it provide all of us with some more wisdom in managing the scarce resources of our small planet. I thank you for your attention.
Okay, now I would like to invite the first panel to the floor, and that is Professor Wieland and also Professor McManus. I would say that you take your name tag and name with you, because we will change positions as of now. Thank you.
So I sense there's silence. That means eagerness to listen. Yeah, good morning to you all. And let me first say that it's really an honor to be here and to have been entrusted with this panel one. Actually, an ingenious idea of the organizers to start the substantive issues with natural resources. The motives may be a little bit vague, because fisheries often give rise to resource disputes, and as we are dealing here with a sea area which is already full of other international disputes, the resource disputes might exacerbate the other disputes. That means these dialectics can be perceived in a negative sense. On the other hand, the fisheries resources could also have a pacifying effect on the other disputes, because fisheries resources presuppose international cooperation. There is no alternative to that. UNCLOS imposes international conservation and cooperation obligations on the states concerned, and there is also the interest to maintain the resource at sustainable levels, and that could also play into the hands of those who seek a peaceful settlement of the disputes in question. So that is probably the motive of the organizers to start with fisheries resources, to have the fisheries here as a pacifying element in this equation, which we will be dealing with throughout the remainder of the day. I surmise this, but I'm a little bit biased, and I take here the dialectics from the more positive aspect of the positive angle of it. We are dealing with a sea area where the fisheries resources are much more important than in other areas. The nutritional dependence of the coastal states in question is much higher than in other parts of the world. The economic importance of fisheries, be it in the primary production sector, also in the secondary, the processing sector, are enormous. So therefore, this is an important issue. I will not dwell too much on the different obligations under UNCLOS, because Mr. Rifkin actually made reference to the relevant provisions of UNCLOS, Article 61, Article 73, to the extent that there are also high seas pockets in this involved. There could be then Article 116, 17, and 118. and 119 of UNCLOS, but this is a little bit too, would then become too legalistic and probably not the appropriate way to conduct this panel. We are, as you have been told, a little bit affected by an act of God or force majeure. Mr. Kuem Langban from the FAO legal office cannot be with us. That is regrettable, deplorable. On the other hand, this offers Professor McManus to my right, who is then the only speaker actually, the possibility to speak a little bit longer, not to be tied into too tight time window for the presentation. Let me introduce Professor McManus. You have seen in the brochure the short CV. I'm not going to read it out again, but what I found really amazing was here that the indication that he and his wife, Dr. Liana McManus, were recognized by the World Technology Network as among the most innovative individuals in the world in 2006. This is almost a decennium ago, but his Professor McManus' reputation is still at the height of things. So I presume that this is also a good description of his standing today. Mr. Professor McManus will give a talk about the Spratly Islands' importance to regional fisheries and options for coordinated management. Well, let's dwell into that directly. Professor, you have the floor, sir.
Okay. I can't tell you how honored I am to be here. I'm usually speaking to lots of ecologists wearing all sorts of things, and it's truly an honor to be at a conference where I'm the one who knows the least about the topic of the conference. We have a room full of international law experts, and I'm not one of those. However, I do have some background knowledge on the ecology of the South China Sea. I spent about 20 years living in the Philippines, studying the area, and I've also been to both Scarborough Reef and some of the southern Spratly Islands. So I'm going to talk briefly about, give you some background on the issue, talk about overfishing in the South China Sea, fish recruitment from the Spratlys, the future of the Spratlys under climate change, which is a new issue that has arisen and will arise more and more in the future, ongoing damaging activities, and about the potential for a Spratly Island Peace Park or variations thereof. So as you can see from the pictures, we have the first picture there is of the number of coral species per region around the world, and the darker area in the center forms sort of an oblong triangle. And so, for instance, in the Caribbean, we have perhaps 70 species of reef-building coral, and in the Coral Triangle, especially the Philippines and Indonesia, we have about 70 genera and about 450 species of coral. And that kind of species richness covers most groups. I warn people who study the Caribbean that when we get them in the water in Southeast Asia, that they're going to come up with a tremendous headache that every group that they're used to dealing with will, in general, have 5 to 7 times as many species, and they won't feel at ease at all. So the area of the Coral Triangle, you see, cuts right next to the Spratly Islands. And, of course, the Spratly Islands have been not, especially the southern ones, have not been very well sampled. So the information we have is going to be underestimate of just about everything. Below that, you see the map of an area of the Spratly Islands. The cursor here is not showing up, but you see there's a circle in the lower left. And so it's inside a basin, which is quite significant, particularly for the people who are concerned about potential oil. It's in a deep basin, and these are... very good. I'll show you. This circle here, this area that's all rough, it's in deep water. I'll show you over here. It's in deep water, and coming up are these ridges. And what's actually happening is that there is an old subduction zone here alongside of Palawan, and the bottom of the ocean was coming down underneath Palawan and getting all wrinkled up. So this is what we call ophiolite-like construction. So that leaves a lot of ridges that were near the surface and grew coral reefs, and then they sank, leaving very oblong coral reef atolls. This process was described for volcanoes by Charles Darwin before he came up with his book on evolution. He would have been famous in coral reef world anyways, but he did it for round volcanoes. So that's why we have these very long features that are semi-submerged. And coming up from those features, you'll see little atolls that form like pearl necklaces around them. And on those little pearls, you will see these structures. Nobody's quite sure how many there are right now because nobody's apparently got the funds to actually do a thorough analysis of the area via satellite imagery. But this, we have at the top a Chinese fort, a Chinese outpost, a Vietnamese one, and we have a ship that is, it's a derelict ship that's stranded on a reef that is actually one of the Philippine outposts. I'll show you pictures of more usual looking outposts, but that one has actually become recently quite important. And then down below we have the Spratly Islands as little colored dots, and the colored dots are where there are outposts from various countries. And of course that includes all 6 nations. We have Vietnam. The Philippines maintains about half. We have Malaysia that has maybe a third. Brunei, which has a few reefs and only 1 outpost. And I'll talk more. Of course, we got the Vietnamese claim that claims most of them. And China claims the whole area, as does Taiwan, which is also China in a sense. The Spratly Islands include approximately 150 named landforms and innumerable unnamed spits of land. Of course, you realize that during storms where you had sand before, it may disappear and new ones arise when you're talking about little bits of sand that pop up along these reefs. As I mentioned again, these are on these ridges and they're extremely steep. So you come to a coral reef and for hundreds of feet, it will be vertical below that. And so you can easily lose sand. Once you lose sand from one of these, it's going to take a long time to generate it. The sand, this will come up later, the sand that you see there is generated by processes of the living ecosystem. It's made of bits and pieces of the calcium carbonate from lots of different things. Corals are just one. Also, many species of algae produce coral. There's microorganisms called foraminifera that produce calcium carbonate, clams, gastropods, snails, that sort of thing. So the sand is created in real time by these organisms, and that's quite important. Now, the southeast monsoon winds blow from March to April, and then we get a shift to the southwest, and you'll see what that does to the currents, and that's quite important as well. So this is a close-up, and you see these ridges here, and you see we've got this highly inadequate coverage from Google Earth, which happens to be, as best I know, the best that's available. You can zoom into these, but you get this idea. If you look at particularly this one structure here, you see it looks like a necklace of pearls. And so you'll have, in some cases, you'll have one country occupying part of one of these things and another country occupying another one, and they consider them all to be coral reefs. But to a coral reef person like myself, it's all one coral reef. Additionally, you'll see occasional pictures of people standing with guns up to their knees in water. This has happened in the past. Now, these are actual photos from the Taiwanese outpost, which is one of the larger islands. It's an actual island to the northeast. And these were from Professor Shao of Taiwan, who is my co-author on a previous paper. Now, the fisheries of the South China Sea are quite important. We had, at least in 2000, about 5% of the world's population living along this coastline, but about 10% of the world's fisheries was coming out of this area. And of course, it looked more like this. So in 1960, this is projected to be the distribution of biomass. This is tons per square kilometer. And then in 2000, you see we lose all the pretty colors here. Those pretty colors were the concentrations of biomass. So this place is radically overfished. And we can see that fishery production has dropped by approximately 50%. This is Villy Christensen and several others who wrote this paper. But they also showed that there is a drop in the trophic level. Trophic level is, if you're at level 1, you're eating algae. Level 2, you're something that eats a herbivore, something that eats the algae. At level 3, you're something that's eating those things. So sharks are 3 or 4, and tuna are usually about 3, and mackerel are about 3. And we're getting a drop in the average trophic level of the fish you catch. In other words, you're losing virtually all of the fish that most of you in here would be interested in eating. And what you're left with are commonly termed as trash fish. However, there are people who actually grew up eating trash fish, and you tend to get used to what you came up with. But certainly the value of this fish in the market is dropping. So this is called fishing down the food web. It's happening all over the world, but in particular, it's happening in the South China Sea. Now, I was here living on the tip of this mitten, which is the Bolinao area of Luzon, for 7 years studying this reef system. And I couldn't figure out why we still had fish. And so somebody said, oh, they're coming from other places. So we tried to figure out some generality here. And so if you take a graph of profit or the amount of fish, and this is a simple graph, so you can use either amount of fish landed or the profit in this particular simple system. And you start fishing, you get more fish, you get more fish, you get more fish as you add more and more people fishing. And this is a very difficult thing to get across. We have to get this across to villagers and everybody, that at some point you add more and more to your fleet or whatever system you're talking about, and you start catching less and less fish. You're catching the parent fish, and there won't be enough to make young fish, okay? So that's what we mean by overfishing. You actually get less. So society, not just the individual, the society that is involved in the fishery is actually getting less fish by overfishing, which explains, for instance, why some people felt that after the tsunami on the west coast of Indonesia, that we should be careful about investing in getting the fleet up, because you're actually going to get more fish if you control how many people are out catching them. You have to control it. This is the big issue. It's counterintuitive, and that makes it a great challenge. And it turns out that the entire coastline here around the South China Sea is going to be at this point, which we call the bioeconomic point. Now, so what happens is, as you add more and more people fishing, the total cost of fishing goes up. It's, you know, whether it's linear or curvy or whatever, it's going to wind up that there is only one equilibrium point from an economic standpoint, and that's the point if you have no social subsidies, you don't have unemployment insurance, you have no way of paying people who are out of work, then the only equilibrium that's going to keep people from coming in and joining you, because you have excess labor, they have to find a way to live. If they have a relative who's making money, that person will invite them in, and you'll add to the fishery. And the only time this stops is when the average person is making no net income. So you wonder why fishers are poor throughout Southeast Asia. That's it. The average person is making no net income. In some cases, say the father will stay and keep fishing at a loss. The kids will go to the cities, earn money, and send them back and subsidize them. But in general, you're making no net income. And we know that that's the case throughout most of Southeast Asia, with the exception of Brunei. Brunei has higher income per person, and also a very interesting situation, which is they have lots of oil rigs and pipes among the oil rigs, oil and gas, and you're not allowed to go near them when you're fishing. So Brunei has one of the world's most effective marine reserve systems. It's just that it's very tiny, relative to what you saw. So there is a marine reserve. It is highly effective, but it's not big enough to share lots of fish, okay? So this is what you wind up with in something we call Malthusian overfishing, the term that Daniel Pauly came up with. And this is a typical landing. There's about 6 fishers operating about 6 hours a day who have dropped this off. Their wives right there are trying to sell them, and that's the kind of fish you get. Now, when you think of coral reef fish, you should be thinking of fish 5 and 6 feet long, at least 4 or 5 feet long. And here we're talking about fish. Most of those fish will be about 10 centimeters. And fortunately, in Southeast Asia, you can fish 10-centimeter herbivorous fish for a considerable time and still feed yourself. We don't know why. We don't know when they're going to collapse totally. But the other trophic levels have collapsed on most of the coastal coral reefs. And you only have these little fish left. Interestingly, in the Caribbean, you can actually run out of fish considerably. You can get very, very few fish. They don't have that diversity. Now, I was studying the fish, and what you see up here is the graph. The top one is the number of individuals we were counting on the reef. There's a very large reef system, more than 200 square kilometers. And about this time, about before 1990, we were seeing a collapse in the adult fish. And you see below, it's actually, we also lost species as this happened, okay? So then suddenly we see some sign that fish are coming back. Where are they coming from? We don't have enough adult fish to explain this. There's over 600 species, and we were down to 70 individuals per hectare. So nobody in their right mind would think that they're producing these fish. So we thought we'd look you know, where they could be coming from. Now, it just happens that in Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, we have a lot of offshore islands, and we have very complex current systems. And they switch back and forth a bit because of those reversing monsoons, but it's not what people thought. In fact, you are looking for the first time at a new animation made for this talk by the visualization people at the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. I'd seen something they'd done, and I said, hey, you know, I don't know if you have a lot of time, but in a couple of weeks, I'm giving a talk on the South China Sea. What can you give me? And they gave me this. So you're the first ones to see that. And what you see there is this massive switching and these vortices. It is not like the Caribbean or the Atlantic Ocean where currents go where currents go. These currents go all kinds of directions. Now, using much more primitive information, so this, I want to thank Greg Chirac and his colleagues, and they did this based on a model by Dimitri Menendez of JPL and MIT. So using much more primitive current information, I tracked out where various fish larvae could go. In April, you see in 1 month, which is the average time a fish has to stay in the water before it'll settle down, we could get up to the paracels in southern Vietnam. See if I can get this to go back there. And in August, we can get fish to the Philippines mostly. Now, the dotted lines are, once you're there, what's the second generation able to do? You see, because you're going to have a supply chain, not just a supplier. And in October, we've got currents winding up with the Paracel Islands and secondarily into Vietnam, and the same for December. And so I just tried a few of these things to see, okay, well, this place could be supplying the area. And back in 1990, there were not a lot of people fishing in the Spratly Islands. Now, since that time, a whole field has come up called particle tracking connectivity among coral reefs. Lots of people using computers, and one of those was a guy who was on his committee, and he did a simulation using the most recent modeling system called HICOM, one of the most modern modeling systems. This is Jonathan Kuhl and his colleagues. And you see, he tracked that first generation, and it basically shows the same thing. The red means that you're going to have a lot of larvae get there, but now as your larvae are in the water, their survival curve reduces very fast. In other words, you produce maybe 1,000 larvae, more than half are going to die in a few days, and then you get less and less death after that. So only a few are going to make it over to these areas. Now, this kind of study in the Caribbean would mean, it means most of your larvae are coming from locally, so mostly you don't have to worry about something 100 miles away. But we have such heavy fishing, as you saw the drop in species before it came back, that we can get local extinction. So why do we still have so many species of fish at all in Southeast Asia? Well, we think it's because of pulses of lucky fish that show up. And this simulation that they did actually showed that on a decadal scale, you get pulses of fish showing up where you didn't expect them, not only across Southeast Asia, but also into the Philippines and into Indonesia, which is something that I didn't actually figure out myself. So it's nice to know that my simple little graph tracings were actually correct. Now, in the meantime, Terry Hughes, working with Chinese co-author Hui Huang and others, did a compilation of more than 1,000 publications, about half in Chinese and half in English, and published in 2012. It's an excellent paper. And one of the things they did was they looked at all the information from coastal coral reefs of China and offshore, which include some of the Spratly Islands. And the triangles that you see, the open ones, are offshore reefs. The circles, the closed circles, that's a drop in the coral cover, the amount of coral by 80% or more in the last 30 years near shores. But these filled triangles, there are actually monitoring sites. And what you see here in a couple of years is a catastrophic drop-off in the sites monitored by the Chinese scientists from about 60% cover to about 20% cover within the last decade, okay, 10 to 15 years. So this is a precipitous drop. And that was, you know, until 2010 or even before. And things have gotten much more interesting since then. Now, some of the fishing that's going on, for instance, this is an offshore version of a Philippine boat, Philippine Banca. And this is an offshore version of a Taiwanese fishing boat. Most of the countries in the area will have something that looks like this, including Vietnam. And the Philippines will have this or something like that as well. And if you're going to sneak into a place where some other country might arrest you, what you want to do is get as much fish as you can and get out quickly. So they save up, and in not just the Philippines, but other countries as well, they will buy lots of explosives. And, you know, there's lots of ways you can make explosives work. And I've been told not to explain this in great detail, especially to my students. But you don't have to have dynamite. So we don't use the term dynamite fishing. It's explosives, usually in bottles. If it's a San Miguel beer bottle, you get about a 1 meter kill radius for coral. And if it's a 10-wide rum bottle, you can get about 2 meters. So this is coral, but of course fish are dying at much greater distances. And it depends on the kind of swim bladder, but you know, hundreds and hundreds of meters away, fish will just drop out. Some will sink, actually most will sink, some will float, and the ones you harvest are the ones that float or are sort of suspended in the water. And most of the fish that you kill, you don't actually recover. But down below we see cyanide fishing. This is used for the aquarium trade, but it turns out there are also large-scale operations where people are dumping it over the side to stun the fish. They gather them up, put them in the market, people buy them and eat them, and are slowly poisoning themselves. It's also true of the live fish trade, such as the groupers and large wrasses you find in some Chinese restaurants. If they were caught by cyanide, they are toxic. This guy is also using a tube, which is, instead of scuba tanks, you put a compressor, maybe a car compressor or a bicycle compressor motor on your boat. You run a tube down, and then you swim underwater. Where this is commonly found, which is throughout the tropics, we found places in the Caribbean, places across Southeast Asia, a typical community will have about 1 in 10 of these divers either paralyzed or dead each year because you have to study, you have to know how to dive, and people don't. So this is very dangerous, but it's also not too healthy for the coral reef. Now, we have these structures out there, and you can see one of these structures. I just got this off of Google Earth last week, and what you see here is a big stream of oil spilled. This is off of Subi Reef. This is a military base. And of course, an older, this is a Philippine base here. That was Chinese. Philippine base down here, in order to make a landing strip on one of these tiny little islands, you had to build out into the reef. And I know from the time that this happened, some friends of mine went out there and they were noticing that some of the reef was actually disappearing, which you don't want to happen. And I'll explain that in particular later. And over the last couple of years, people have written to me from all kinds of sectors of society and military organizations and saying, what is this? If you see, this is this is Fiery Cross Atoll. And this is a close-up. And they were seeing just a few, because there's only a few places where there's satellite imagery, just a few of them, they were noticing these clam-like formations. And they were saying, well, there's a kind of fishing where you smash corals and things called moroami. They were asking me, are those moroami marks? Well, no, they're not. They're nothing like that. What they are is dredge marks. You have a boat, you have a tube sticking out. Maybe it's grinding, maybe not, but it's a suction dredge, and you sweep it back and forth in front of your boat, going either forwards or backwards, and it makes these clam marks. There's nothing else that does this. So for the last couple of years, we were saying, well, why do people need this sand? Remember, the sand is a non-sustainable resource here. It grows very slowly from the actual dead bodies of coral reef organisms, extremely, hundreds of years, okay? It's also full of things. This is not a desert. You swim across this, you'll see gorgonians, you'll see giant clams, you'll see every square meter will have things in it, life in there, and it's all part of the reef ecosystem. So, oh yeah, it's just sand. Yeah, put your hands in there, and if you don't get stung by something, you'll find things alive. Just scoop it up, there will be things alive. So this place was systematically wiped out. And if you look closely here at this lower one, you'll see actually 3 streams of sediment coming off of this thing. Those are actually 3 dredging boats. And this is available on Google Earth, as far as I know, still this week. Okay, you just zoom right in to Fiery Cross Reef. You won't see something as you back up, you'll see a blur, but when you zoom right in, they have an image that actually shows this. And this one is an older one from 2012, or maybe 2014. Now, we suddenly found out what the sand was for, at least some of that sand, is going into building islands. Now, those little stations weren't big enough, especially for landing aircraft. And it just, in this case, it's mostly China that's building 6 large islands on those reef flats, okay? And you can find this, you go to the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. They have a wonderful pictorial online thing, and this is just one of the pictures, and you'll see everything going on, the dredgers and all of this sort of thing. Now, you notice here, you see where the waves are breaking on the outside? That is what allows this to happen. And that is a piece of the reef about the size of this table in width and height, okay? That's the reef crest, okay? That's going to be important in a minute. But let me show you what happens to coral under sediment. I was studying the area around Punta Cana in Dominican Republic, and they did just a little dredging so that the wealthy people could bring their little boats up to their house along an 8-kilometer reef. And just a little bit of dredging, about as deep as the area inside this table. And for a kilometer away, picture was from a kilometer away from that dredging, just about every piece of coral was dying or dead. And you see this brain coral here, it's got the sediment on top. The sediment has killed the material. What happens is the coral exudes mucus, and it mixes with that calcium carbonate, which is very rough material. It mixes with that, and if there's not enough current, you get enough sediment, enough mucus, it just stays there and smothers the coral. And this can happen on massive scales. And you see also there's a sea fan in this case, and that sea fan is also going to pick up diseases from being under stress. So this is what happens, and about 6 kilometers of that reef was actually severely damaged, a kilometer away from the dredging. Now, that's a little bit. We're talking massive dredging with no nets or anything trying to keep it down, and building, pouring sand where it wasn't before. which anyone who's seen trucks trying to replace beaches, you know, along whatever part of the coastline, you'll see it's really hard to keep sand. You can't control sand. It's best to treat sand next to water as slow-moving water. That's really how you deal with it. It will go away. It's just does it slowly. Now, let's talk for a minute about what's going to happen to the Spratlys under climate change. The first thing is, it's, again, about 10% of the world's fisheries, even though it's dropping radically, but then the whole world is losing fish, and we're all getting closer to learning to like to pay large amounts of money for jellyfish, because that's what we're going to be left with. It turns out that it's actually quite tasty, and you'll get used to it. So the whole world is fishing down the food web. But one of the things that's happening is the world is getting warmer. Now, if you take a given fish, if you want to transport a fish, you can cool it down, and then it will use less oxygen. Okay? So you can refrigerate coral reef fish and move them. But if you look at the survival against temperature, there's a rapid drop near the hot end. In other words, you heat up a fish a little bit more than what it's used to, and it will die. This has to do with the fact that fish size and energetics are heavily controlled by oxygen, but they want to be as big as bad as they possibly can as they grow anyway, so they push the limit. And the minute you raise the temperature, fish can start dropping dead. Now, you say, well, the world's getting warmer, it's a little bit gradual, so why aren't they adapting? Well, you need generations, many generations to adapt, and you need radical physiological change to allow fish to evolve to warmer waters. So a number of people associated with Daniel Pauly, but in this case Jones and Chung, looked around the world at what's happening, what's going to happen under, now this is the sort of the most modest prediction for climate change, and the red here are the species being lost, and this is the sort of if we don't fix things view. Over here, this is RCP 8.5, and this is the number of fish being lost. So clearly, now the blue one is fish migrating in. So if you're in colder areas, you're going to get warmer fish moving in, which makes perfect sense. But the warmer places are just going to lose fish. And what they have estimated that between 10 degrees north and south of the equator, you're going to lose about 6.5 species per 0.5 degrees of latitude. Okay? So that's a lot of species, but that's around the world. Now remember, the species richness is much higher in the South China Sea, so we're talking much, much more fish, and they haven't quite broken it down yet. This is a brand new paper, 2014. I'm sure they're going to figure that out soon. So we're going to lose a lot of species just because it's getting warmer. But the reefs themselves, sea level is rising. The water's getting warm. It's killing coral in some places. The corals are recovering, but we don't know how long that's going to keep happening. The oceans are getting a little relatively more acidic. They're never going to be acid, but they're more acidic than they were. Calcium carbonate is water soluble if you get anywhere near the pH of regular water. So that means that the reefs themselves, which are growing slowly, are going to grow less slowly, and sea level is coming up. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So this is before they built an island. This is a Chinese outpost on South Johnson Atoll. I used to love to, I'd say, oh, this is a reef, and then I zoom in, oh, and there we see a military base. This one was easy to find, but what you see here, the waves are crashing outside on the lower edge here, That's where the wind is coming from. And then you have a lagoon. So what that looks like, this is actually modified from on shore. But I tell my students, anybody who's not too inhibited, if you hold your hand like this, you have a model of a coral reef. If it's like this, it's a fringing reef. If it's like this, it's an atoll. But as you come in, you get spurs and grooves that break up wave action. You've got the crest, which are my knuckles here. Then you have a reef flat. My reef flat has seagrass. Some of you don't. That's the way it is. See the seagrass here? And then there would be land if it's a fringing reef, or you're going to get a lagoon if it's an atoll. But that's the way these things are. So the waves are breaking here. More than 90% of the energy of a wave will break before it gets over that thing. If this is underwater, you lose that. And all of these islands that are being built, they're going to disappear. If the construction rate of the reef, which is a few millimeters a year, is unable to keep up with sea level rise. So what's sea level rise? The rate of sea level rise. These are the latest figures, and what we see for 8.5 is maybe they're going to get 10 millimeters a year. And although coral can grow 10 centimeters a year, typically, for fast-growing ones, the reef itself grows very slowly. So this is paleontological information on reef growth. It just happens the Caribbean is studied like crazy because it's convenient. And you see that for the Caribbean, getting up to 10 millimeters a year is already hard to do. So we're talking a very tight balance between the water rising and the reef keeping up. And we don't know where it's going to be, but if you start beating up the coral reef, it will not keep up. So we may actually lose them, we're not quite sure, but you don't want to be messing with them. So we came up with this idea initially of a peace park. I won't read through the full definition, we'll run over time, but there are more than 200 trans-boundary parks worldwide. Initial peace park was 1932 between Canada and the US. That surprised me. I always thought, you know, why would we need peace? But apparently that's one reason we have peace. The Waterston Glacier International Peace Park, 1932, and now we've got hundreds of them around the world, and some of them have been put in specifically to prevent arguing over resources, including one off of a marine one between Israel and Jordan that is now being extended hopefully into Egypt. Okay? But the Antarctic Treaty was quite interesting. That was originally a bunch of countries. It wound up being 12 with claims there. And there was actually some shooting going on, I'm told, but I haven't heard of anyone actually being hit by a bullet. I think it's because it's very cold in Antarctica and very hard to aim, perhaps. I just don't know. But the treaty does not recognize, dispute, or establish sovereignty claims, and no new claims may be asserted while the treaty is in force. So you don't have this fighting going on. There's an agreement that, as far as I understand it, things you do during the course of the agreement cannot be used to support your claim in the future. So the posing stops. The posturing stops. You don't put post offices on little islands anymore. You don't put radar where you don't need them or weather stations where you don't need them. And you don't waste enormous amounts of money putting military bases. If we can get a freeze on claims, an Antarctic freeze on claims, then that would reduce the tensions enormously. And the idea is, can you do this with the Spratlys? If you were to set this up, you would probably want a board of directors, an international board of directors for the Spratlys. You'd want to contract a monitoring and management institution, a private ranger, air-sea rescue force. There's no rescue going on. There's 2 clinics in the entire Spratlys. And so if you've been guarding against, say, the Taiwanese up in the north and someone gets hurt, you say, okay, we're going to bring you over to the Taiwanese to patch you up. This is what's happening, seriously. All right, so you have to fix that. And you could put up tourism facilities and research facilities. You want them to be sustainable. This is the only tourist place right now. This is Malaysian. It's Layang Layang, Swallow Reef. And it's supposed to be some of the best diving in the world. and they do a lot of research there. But if you can't get everybody to the table at once, one thing you could do is start turning the military bases into the centers of protected areas. And you would then set up networks in relationship to other places. And the more you set up, you'd wind up with a network of protected areas, which, as you saw, does govern not just the occasional pulse, but the annual pulses of larvae coming in, because they're close enough that that would be the case. And the fact is that ranger stations are much less expensive than military bases. So we leave you with this question: can the Peace Park be implemented as an extension of ongoing efforts to establish a code of conduct for the region? So I'll leave you with that.
Yes, thank you, Professor McManus. This was certainly interesting and shows the multitude of challenges ahead. As far as I see it, we still have a couple of 10 minutes. Are there any questions, suggestions, contributions from the floor? I recognize the lady over there. You have the floor, madam.
Yes, good morning. My name is Barbara Stempien. Thank you very much for a very interesting and detailed presentation. And I have a few questions in relation to it. First of all, I'd like to just make it clear if this idea about the peace parks would lead to the situation that any fishery would be completely prohibited in this area. Because if so, I'd like to ask about the influence of such a situation of the regional population and also for the international, worldwide situation. Because as we know, within 50 years, most likely the Earth population is going to be doubled. And most likely we won't be able to get enough food from the land resources. That's why the only way of getting enough nutrition would be provided from the maritime resources. So if by establishing such a peace park, not only in this area but also in other regions all over the world, if by such an actions we would not prohibit ourselves the very good way of possessing new food and natural resources to feed the human population. And another question is if, for example, the solutions which were introduced in Caribbean, such as, because they had very similar problem in Caribbean region with overfishing the area. And then there was a, let's say, bottom-up initiative which was introduced by the local populations, and then themselves stopped fishing in some areas to give fish and maritime fauna and flora time to recover. And that's how they were exchanging places. So for some months this area was closed for fishermen, then another one and another one. So, but at the same time it wasn't completely prohibited. The natural fauna and flora got time to recover, and the local population could get additional food because of fishing in other areas. So maybe this kind of agreement, I understand that in South China Sea it might be complicated because of still problems with jurisdiction and the delimitation of area to whom it belongs. It's still complicated to introduce such a solution. But maybe even though, because of the situation which is in the region, maybe it would be helpful for the not only regional, local populations, but also to international community. Thank you.
Thank you, especially for asking me something I can actually answer. That was a concern coming here. No, I actually do work on this. This is my area. And for the first one, can you fish in a reserve? You can go fishing in the Great Barrier Marine Park. The thing about a park in this sense is that you have control over the situation. And as I showed you, it's very easy to overfish. We say, give a person a fish, they eat for a day. Teach a person to fish, they will deplete the resource. This is the most universal law of fisheries. And so you do have to control it. It can't be just based on market forces. You have to control the level of fishing to get the most out. So there would be an international board, and I can't imagine them totally preventing fishing. On the other hand, if they did theoretically prevent fishing there, you would still have more consistent, sustainable fisheries around the South China Sea because of the first and second generation larvae coming out of this place. So most likely the fishing controls, and there's bags of things, tools we use, small protected areas, large protected areas, and then there would be fished areas most likely. And the idea is to keep that population healthy and benefit the region. And the same issue again comes up with oil drilling. Actually, in Australia, occasionally people have to get together to stop oil drilling in the park, because just because it's a park doesn't mean automatically that you're not doing other kinds of resource exploitation. The idea of a park is that you have a good control over resource use. As far as the village level management work, most of what's going on in the Caribbean actually was tested out in the Philippines, which has the world's largest network of village participatory managed coastlines, which includes a reserve system. About 40% of them actually work, but there are hundreds, and that means you have hundreds that work. And it's well known there. There's some going up in Vietnam, Indonesia. It's spread particularly around this area. And so, yes, that's happening, but you have to have villages for that to make sense. Vietnam has villages now on some of these places, and sort of as part of the posturing. You put a lot of people there. They make a living there, but there are no traditional people in these. These were uninhabited islands. So among those, yes, you could get together and have some agreements. But that's something we do on the coastlines with the people that are really poor, and we try to set aside little reserves, about a quarter square kilometer, or a quarter of a given area that you fish, and then we actually see returns. The more heavily fished it is, the more you see a return, and you'll see a return within 4 or 5 years in Southeast Asia from those. And yes, those are great ideas. We just don't put them in the Spratlys. Spratlys has to be dealt with separately.
Sir, please.
Thanks, John, for a great presentation, and for a non-lawyer learning still more about corals and the fisheries situation in the South China Sea. And I have no real question, but I'm obligated to go up to 11:15 on the coffee time, and Eric assigned me this task. Just a small comment about some of the history. The Antarctic idea, which is very popular in certain parts of the world, like Europe, for a variety of different regions, particularly the Arctic. In the South China Sea, of course, but it's a reality that the idea of freezing claims goes back 30 years. And it's one that has been talked about even amongst, if not the governments directly, then certainly the governments in an informal sense. It has never really gotten very much traction. This is not to discourage the idea. It is a great idea. It would solve an awful lot of problems. It would enhance the population's economics. It would protect the fisheries resources in one form or another. But it hasn't really had any kind of political traction. The South China Sea and fisheries has had very little success in terms of its international perceptions. In other words, regional fisheries management organizations are out of bounds there. In fact, in the South China Sea, There's not even an acceptable UNEP, Regional Seas program, when you really get down to it. It has largely been a failure. If not a failure, that's unfair. It has never really developed beyond the very basic structure. There's not an internet, there's not that treaties matter. I mean, I'm a lawyer, I understand treaties. Just in terms of the type of cooperation on science that exists is somewhat limited. Now, it is increased and there has been better arrangements amongst the scientists in the last decade or so, but when you go back in time, it's not been very, very successful when it gets right down to it. Not to be too pessimistic about the fisheries issues. There are successes on fisheries if you broaden your look at Asia. The Vietnam, and I'll look at my friend Quen there for a clue here, that the Vietnam-China fisheries arrangements in the Gulf of Tonkin have been moderately successful. There's been moderate success between Vietnam and Thailand in their issues, bilateral issues in terms of overfishing in some of their waters that don't spread into the South China Sea per se. I mean, the Gulf of Thailand's been largely fished out, but in terms of their relations. China's had good success or reasonable success with Japan and Korea on some of their intermeasures agreements when you get into the Northeast Asia area. I'm not saying these things are perfect, but they actually have worked. So I don't want to be super pessimistic, but the South China Sea has not really thus far shown much interest on the parts of states. And as you point out or alluded to, in some cases the fisheries are being used for political purposes, and where fishing vessels are going where they probably wouldn't otherwise go, but being somewhat directed in one form or another. And that's not by a particular state, that's by a number of states that are playing into that game in one form or another. So when we look at the fisheries context in South China Sea, I think the point that you made to me earlier before we started is that that's really the resource that matters, in some respects more so than the oil and gas, in the center of the South China Sea. Now, around the edges, it's a little bit different. But that's not been the focus of where the states have tended to be interested in cooperation thus far. And it's even interesting that it's not been the focus of cooperation amongst the ASEAN states that might otherwise want to cooperate a little bit more. We're not even talking about the overall structure of South China Sea discussions tend to be ASEAN-China, but even within ASEAN, there's been very little fisheries coordination. I don't even want to go to cooperation. CFDEC, I'm not even sure how successful that's been in recent years. Different countries have not been parties to it. So we are looking at an area of the world which has very low international, again, I don't want to use the word cooperate, even coordination. So any step forward would be positive. I think we're a long ways away from an Antarcticization of the South China Sea around fisheries, but I think that as an idea, it needs to continue to be promoted even if people like me come in and say that, well, it hasn't worked yet. I'm a big believer in the future. So just a few idle comments from someone who's been around the South China Sea for a few decades.
Yes, I agree in general. I will say it's not really the science, although there was an organization that actually Ted was involved with in getting scientists together, but there were a number of initiatives. The scientists around this area will walk into each other's lab occasionally and oh yeah, I didn't even know you left. The exchange is tremendous among the scientists of Southeast Asia, and China is actually doing, mainland China is doing some very good research. You saw some of it. And of course, Taiwan's doing intensive research. And also, as you know, it's official Taiwanese policy to try to come up with a cooperative arrangement for the area. If one of the reasons, oddly enough, is because to get to their station by boat, and sometimes they're concerned about trying to fly, to get there it can take 4 days, and from Palawan it would take less than 1 day. So it's government policy there. 2 presidents there have spoken out in favor of it. President Ramos spoke out in favor of this during the near conflict that the Philippines had over some of the reef areas. And the scientists tend to be all for coordination. It is the implementation that's the difficulty. China itself has actually been putting in some fishing controls, seasonal closures. That was somehow tied to the incident in the Scarborough Reef, but they are trying to, and I have heard the excuse that, well, you know, we don't really have enough control over the area, otherwise we could control the resource. And now there's a new head of environment for China, and so we've got a little more hope there. But yes, it's going to have to be cooperative, and they're going to have to stop the posturing. And so somehow into these negotiations for the code of conduct, if there could be some kind of agreement to stop the claimant activity. And you don't lose face if you're just pausing. And that's what I think has to happen.
Mr. Anderson, please.
I'd like to join Ted in thanking Professor McManus for a fascinating paper. I've got 2 points. As regards the Antarctic Treaty, the first major international conference I attended was here in Brussels in 1964, the consultative meeting of the Antarctic Treaty. And we adopted the agreed measures on the conservation of Antarctic fauna and flora, I remember. Well, yes, I think that was the final title. Now, the Antarctic Treaty is a fascinating example of international cooperation faced with sovereignty disputes. But the original 12, we used to talk about the club of 12. It included all the stakeholders, not just the claimant states. You have to include other stakeholders. Now, in your case, the South China Sea, that must include states like Thailand, which have a history of distant water fishing. At the conference, we tried to accommodate Thailand, giving them some measure of access to the archipelagic waters which Indonesia and the Philippines were going to acquire as a result of the conference. But we weren't terribly successful, I always thought. I thought Thailand got something of a raw deal. But eventually they've become a party, so that's good. So you have to include all the stakeholders, other states whose nationals have fished in the area. You must include the FAO as well. They're sort of the international stakeholder, because it's in absolutely no one's interest that this fishery is exhausted. The Philippines has one of the highest per capita fish protein consumption rates, I believe, even higher than Spain. So it's in no one's interest that these people are left with insufficient protein supplies. Now, my second point, I've been in this room many times when Belgium had the presidency of the European Union. And of course, the North Sea is a good example of an international pooling. We have the common fisheries policy. The borders are pretty irrelevant. I stand subject to correction by our chairman, of course, who was the leading expert on this subject, and we've had many hours together in negotiations about it. But the European model might have insights which could be translated to the more tropical waters of the South China Sea. Thank you.
Yes, I would not dare contradict. It is an interesting idea. I'm only afraid that for the Asian countries, the model of the common fisheries policy would not be so attractive because it is linked up with transfer of competence. And transfer of competence is viewed, or competence, sovereignty, is viewed by many states as a sacred cow, and this puts some limits to the exportability of the common fisheries policy as a model cooperative approach to fisheries. But one should not lose hope, because the very idea is to protect the resource, and what Professor McManus said, control, that is quite important. Keep control and try to delink the fisheries issues from the jurisdictional, the boundary issues. Because by the end of the day, even the states which are involved in boundary disputes, they are still under an obligation to enter into practical arrangements of a practical nature pending the resolution of the delimitation dispute. And this is actually the place where practical cooperation in fisheries could come to the fore. I would not be so pessimistic, and I would not predict that the fisheries become hostage of the boundary disputes. Of course, there is posturing there. Of course, the states concerned, most probably all of them, have learned their lessons in Western management schools and have attended courses in assertiveness, and bring this also to the fore, how to assert their claims, etc. But by the end of the day, when they learn that the resource, the material basis of activity will vanish if they don't do anything, then very quickly things might change to the positive. The big problem, of course, with fisheries is that there's also the psychological aspect. I mean, when the precautionary approach was developed in the 1990s, there was much hope that this would bring a new impetus into more rational and more responsible fisheries management. Unfortunately, fishermen have still maintained, and the politicians who support fishermen have maintained this psychology, go to the cliff and really look into the abyss and then perhaps do something, in a situation where the precautionary approach would actually have meant stay away from the cliff and be responsible. Mais bon, I would not, I'd like to close here with too negative a tone. It is really a challenge, a multifaceted aspect, multifaceted topic. It is part of the equation which will occupy us for the remainder of the day. And with this, if I have all your permission, actually, I presume that you are all seeking to have a coffee break now, a biological break. With this, I stop at this point in time, and then we meet again afterwards.
Thank you all.
And I simply add to this that, yes, we now have the coffee break. It will be served in the same room where we came this morning for coffee. And I propose that we meet here back at 11:45. See you then.